Davante Adams' short stint with the Jets is officially over, but it looks like Tee Higgins will be staying in Cincinnati. We talk through the latest free agent wide receiver outlook on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL, fantasy, and betting for sportingnews.com.
We are just, 5-6 days away from the free agency tampering period allowed to start, right? And we are already getting a bunch of news here with the franchise deadline coming today. We had Tee Higgins franchise tagged a couple days ago, and it looks like he'll be staying in Cincinnati. Of course, they could always franchise tag him and trade him, but for now, it does look like they're trying to get a long-term deal done. Davante Adams officially got released today, so he kind of bumps up to the top of the free agents available out there, right? Because there's Chris Godwin that maybe is competing with him for the top there, maybe Stefon Diggs. It's a lot of aging vets besides really Chris Godwin, and then you have old man Davante Adams out there. So we're going to get into the top free agents where we'd like to see them go. But first, let's talk about Tee Higgins getting tagged and Davante Adams getting released. So Tee Higgins gets tagged by the Bengals. Does this move Joe Burrow up for you in our rankings? Because in our consensus rankings, we had him as our quarterback 5. Does this move it at all?
Yeah, it's very hard to put him so much higher, right? Because you know that Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, they're so consistent with their production. They're dual threats. He's not going to give you that big running production. We know he can run a little bit to pad his stats, but nothing to carry that. And then you look at the upside of Jaden Daniels. So you're starting maybe at QB4 at the best. Can somebody else cut in to that? I mean, you could have some different players, but I think he's QB4, QB5, however you look at it. I think when you can unequivocally say he's the best of the pocket passers, right? If you want to call him that he's going to put up numbers without needing to run, and the high volume is going to continue. And this says that with the signing of Tee Higgins soon, hopefully, and Jamar Chase to that long-term extension. I think this is why they had to do it this way. They're kind of putting a placeholder. I think this is the classic franchise tag placeholder. They're not going to pay him that $26.2 million, the exponential increase from last year's franchise tag. He's probably not going to get that because that's not really the smartest way to do it, where you can offset some things with Jamar Chase. I think they want to figure out the Chase numbers because he's a no-brainer. They're going to lock him up with Joe Burrow, make him the highest paid non-quarterback in the league, probably around $36, $37 million a season. So he's the easy one. Tee Higgins a little bit harder. Do you push past the $30 million per season mark with him? Does that push him up to first 2 years would be like 60 to 65 guaranteed? Do you want to really go up that high for Tee Higgins, or are you going to entertain some offers? So what I think is they're going to keep him because, again, I think you can pick 4 players to keep, basically, if you're a team. And these 3, Burrow and Chase and Higgins, are 3. I think Trey Hendrickson will be the other deal that they sort out. So once they figure out the puzzle with Hendrickson and Chase, I think then they can know how much to pay Higgins. Then they can keep these guys intact because I think they can't win big unless they have these 4 guys here in 2025. So again, Burrow, you can't move up too high. Jamar Chase, again, he's Jamar Chase. He's at 1. So I don't know how much you can do. But Tee Higgins, by the way, average scoring was right there in the top 12, top 15 last year in half-point PPR. So he was almost a wide receiver 1 as well.
Well, in half-point, in average scoring, he was actually wide receiver 4 overall with Jamar Chase number 1. But when talking about Joe Burrow here, it is hard to get him above those runners, right? Because right now he's sitting at number 5 for us, right behind Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Jaden Daniels. It's like that's the issue, is that he's missing that running ability to give you the floor. I will say, though, in the 12 games that he had both Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins last year, he averaged 23.5 fantasy points per game. And I mean, without Tee Higgins, it was still great, 20 fantasy points per game. But the difference between a 20 fantasy points per game, that's a little bit above what Jared Goff did this last year, and 23.5. I mean, that's a 1.5 more than what Josh Allen averaged this past year. that is a pretty massive difference between being elite league winner type quarterback and then just being a really, really good fantasy quarterback. So I do think it makes me so much more confident about my quarterback 5 ranking, and I'm fine if you want to take him earlier, but it is hard to push him above those running quarterbacks. Now, you brought up Jamar Chase, and I was just like, maybe this might worry some people about taking him the 101, right? But he did actually average more fantasy points in the games with Tee Higgins than without. In the games with Tee Higgins, he averaged 21 fantasy points per game in half PPR. In the games without, it was 17.6. And it was only that high because he had his 50-point game without Tee Higgins. So even with that 50-point massive game, there was only an average of 17.7 fantasy points per game without Tee Higgins in those 5 games. The other games were 9 points, 5.5, 7.8, and 15.9. So this whole offense is better when Tee Higgins is on the field, including Jamar Chase. And I think there's room for both Chase and Tee Higgins to have a great fantasy season. Where do you have Tee Higgins ranked, though? That's the question, right? Because he did have such a good year in terms of average production, but we have yet to see him put together a full elite season, right? Whether it's due to injuries or just lower production. So where's your confidence lie with him? Where can you rank him right now?
Yeah, maybe I was looking ahead to where I was thinking about him, but I think 12 to 15, 12 to 20, maybe. I don't think I'm going to push past 15 with him in this offense. Again, the durability issue is the concern, but that's a concern with Joe Burrow too, right? To get him on the field. I mean, it seems like every other year Joe Burrow has an injury issue. So when we look at this, I mean, it's much like the Eagles situation, right? Can they sustain 2 guys for the duration of the season? And you mentioned Higgins scoring at that high level, but he missed a lot of games. So you didn't have him available for a lot of games. And that's important when you're thinking about season and drafting. Is he a guy that is going to have that injury-prone label carry as he gets a little bit older? I don't think you can look at it that way. I think you look at this offense. I mean, I think, let's say this. You have the A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith situation. I think Higgins is a lot more valuable behind Chase to the Bengals than Smith is to Brown. I'll say that, where Smith can be the big play guy at times, but Higgins they need to use in the flow of the offense because there's not really a lot here. Let's see what they do at tight end if they replace Mike Gesicki. Remember, Tyler Boyd is out of this mix, and he was a guy that was cutting into it. So I don't think it's going to be Jermaine Burton, but will somebody else be drafted or added to this team as a third receiver, whether it's a tight end or slot that cuts into it? If that's the case, then you might see his numbers drop a little bit, but I still think he's safe. At worst in the 15 to 20 range. I think he's more looking at the 10 to 15 range right now where you're going to draft him. So let's hope he stays healthy, has a good offseason. They get the deal done. There's not that hanging over. And then we're all hunky-dory with Chase and Higgins and Burrow having a big year together.
I do think if he stays healthy for the full year, or even like most of it, right, for 15, 16 games, he will be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver next year. It's just hard to predict that he can do that because we haven't seen it yet. So I have him right now at wide receiver 14, just behind guys that are wide receiver 1s on their team, like A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill, Drake London, Terry McLaurin, and Ladd McConkey for the moment. We'll see who the Chargers bring in, and then maybe that's when Tee Higgins can kind of jump him. But I love Tee Higgins, and I love him on my team. It's just hard to get him ranked much higher than that when you know Jamar Chase is the alpha there. Now we're going to move over to Davante Adams getting released by the Jets. It was a foregone conclusion, right? He was going to be paid like $38 million this year. They don't have a quarterback. He wants to play with Aaron Rodgers, but it was official today. So we're going to talk about what does he have left in the tank and where do we see him playing next year? Does it have to be with Aaron Rodgers? Who knows? But we'll get to that right after a quick break.
This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout games. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets with the same game parlay. Last night, we had a pretty good matchup with Steph Curry going back to Charlotte. The savvy bet there was looking at the assists going higher and the points going lower because they didn't have to do a lot. And the Warriors took care of business easily in that game. So sometimes you look at those combinations, and Curry returning home to Charlotte was a great game to attack, and we've got plenty more, and we'll see how we go forward. Now the Mavs are very exploitable too without Kyrie Irving. So a lot of things that you're going to look at. here. It's going to be an interesting NBA stretch run. And you got to use the FanDuel live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether you're backing your team for late game rallies or picking players to hit clutch streaks. You never are missing your chance. The app is so easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, FanDuel customers that are new to the site get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. It's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Michelle, it's time to continue the show. Yes, this is a very expected result after the Jets said they were going to part ways with Aaron Rodgers. They're going to wait on that cut officially, but did not wait on Davante Adams. He's now going to the free agent pool. And the funny thing is he's 32, but you have Chris Godwin and Stefon Diggs. But both of those guys, Godwin ankle injury, another big one with the knee for Stefon Diggs coming off an injury. So he's the veteran, healthy, best option in free agency now that Tee Higgins is not there. So what do we think of this? And I think, I don't know if he has too much left here, but he's still Davante Adams, right? He's a future Hall of Famer.
And I still think he probably does have something left. It was a slow start for him to the season with the Raiders and then the first couple games with the Jets. But in his 11 games with the Jets, he was averaging 77.6 receiving yards per game. That's a 17-game pace for 1,319 yards. And also he was on pace for 11 receiving touchdowns if he played the full season with Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. So he still was on a pace for a fantastic season. I do think he still has it in him, maybe one more year. It just comes down to where does he land? He needs to be with a good offense, a good quarterback. And I know he really wants to play with Aaron Rodgers, but I cannot really find a landing spot. It's hard enough to find a landing spot for just Aaron Rodgers, right? I think there's a lot more good landing spots for Davante Adams than there is for Aaron Rodgers. Like,
right.
He really needs to be a duo package. I think maybe the Giants might be their only option, unless the Titans really want to just get money and get tickets, but that's not going to help them with their franchise moving forward. So I think a great landing spot for Davante Adams would be with the San Francisco 49ers. They just moved on from Debo. I think he could be the wide receiver one there this next year. He could try to win a Super Bowl. I think that'd be a great fit, or maybe go to the Buccaneers or maybe the Rams, back to Green Bay. There really are a ton of options for him.
Yeah, he's going to get a lot more interest, especially with no Higgins. And again, Godwin, there's going to be some pause because of injury, as well as Diggs. I mean, these guys are all in their 30s. Godwin's about to be in his 30s. But when you look at this situation, Davante Adams is a very good red zone receiver. He's going to still do that. He's shown actually some more big playability after the catch in recent seasons where we didn't see it as much. So he's still very valuable for a team. Now, the rumors are that he wants to go back to California, but when Michelle talked about him trying to match up with Aaron Rodgers, that's not going to work because none of the California teams are going to want it. Brock Purdy's going to get a deal. Matthew Stafford is staying put. Justin Herbert's not going anywhere. So there's no real options there. So, I mean, does any of these teams look at Derek Carr? I don't think so. That would draw Davante Adams. So you look at the options. I think the 49ers are good. I don't know if they can splurge there. Maybe they have to go get a defensive impact player, right, at maybe corner or edge rusher. So that might be a higher priority. Where you look at Adams, a possibility to me is the Rams, right? They need that complementary receiver to Puka Nacua. That's another team that can contend with Stafford being there. So, they're a playoff team. They're out there. It takes him back to California. I know he's from the northern side, but still an opportunity to get to the West Coast. Now, the Giants, I think, would be his only option. That's not terrible, right? Playing off Malik Neighbors, that duo would be pretty good. But then where else do you look at this? I mean, I think he can fit basically anywhere. I'm just going to say, he just needs to complement another receiver at this point. He doesn't necessarily need to be the alpha. If he's with the Puka Nacua, that's fine. He was with a Garrett Wilson this year, and we saw some of the production. So I would like to go to a place, that has a decent, at least a threatening other receiver, right? Somebody that is going to make some plays, and B, a quarterback who's going to target him a lot in the red zone. So those are really the only two pieces of criteria I need for Davante Adams. I think he can fit in a variety of offenses. So I just also want him to go to a good team. I don't want it to be like a bad team that's going to struggle to get the ball. And you mentioned the Bucs. That would be interesting, right? If they want to replace Godwin, or you look at the Texans, maybe they want to replace what they had in Stefon Diggs and the always now injured Tank Dell. So they might need to do that and upgrade with Nico Collins. So there are a lot of possibilities that make you excited for Davante Adams. So I think he goes in, Michelle, as a wide receiver 2, no matter where he lands at this point.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. I just hope he's not like adamant about following Aaron Rodgers. Like, I don't think that's the best for his job. Now, when it comes to Garrett Wilson, so he doesn't have Davante Adams with him again, right? He's the only wide receiver left again with the New York Jets. We don't know who his next quarterback will be, but he's primed for 170 plus targets next year, right? Like, he even had 154 this year with playing with Davante Adams. I just don't know what to do with him when it comes to rankings, because all of these targets he's received every year, he consistently 150 plus targets. It's not turning into elite fantasy points, right? Definitely by far his best year this past year. But among the 32 players with at least 300 targets since 2022, he averages the fewest yards per target. Among wide receivers, only Evan Ingram and David Njoku average fewer among all players. So it's at 6.9 yards per target. And there's other guys playing with bad quarterbacks. I do think Garrett Wilson's very talented, but there's something here that's not hitting for fantasy.
Yeah, I think partly is the quarterback turnover has been massive, right? I mean, he started with Zach Wilson. That wasn't all that great. And then you got to that Aaron Rodgers there, and then he was out, and then you had to recycle all those guys in between. And it just was really tough for him to get any consistency or rhythm with a particular quarterback. And that's what he needs. Look, we dump on Derek Carr quite a bit, but if Derek Carr went to the Jets, he would facilitate Garrett Wilson. I mean, he just did that with Chris Olave as best as he could, but we know in this particular offense, it's also a Ben Johnson extension, right, with Tanner Engstrand there. That's one of my favorite offensive coordinator names, but he's over there now, so they will do things that they did with Ross St. Brown, right? He could just eat up targets, just destroy the targets. Maybe the Jets go get a tight end as well and kind of try to recreate what they had with St. Brown and Laporta, and then Breece Hall being a big part like Jahmyr Gibbs. Maybe that's the offense, and maybe it's streamlined between 3 guys. So a lot of the Lions mentality, even with Aaron Glenn, is going over to the Jets, right? So kind of draw some parallels. This could actually be good for Garrett Wilson. The only missing piece is get a decent quarterback. Like, I'd be fine with Derek Carr. If he's in there, if it's like a Kirk Cousins, I'm fine, because he's a veteran guy, so we're going to target a guy. Often when you maybe get a project quarterback there, or Jackson Dart, or then you're looking or forcing in Jimmy Garoppolo, or say some random bridge quarterback, even a Jameis Winston, I'd be okay. So I think you just need a decent quarterback who's going to target Wilson a lot, and I think he'll have his best season. Enough of this fickle nature with quarterback and Wilson, just throwing the ball as much as you can.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep staying away for now. This Jets offense without another quarterback again, it's just going to be hard to trust any of these guys. I mean, how many times can we hope that Breece Hall is a top 3 running back, or Garrett Wilson truly breaks out? It's just hard to trust that. And I know people beg, he was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver this year, but it didn't feel like it, right? He didn't give you as many winning weeks or consistency as you would like. We have 3 guys, though, that are going to be in free agency on top of Davante Adams that I do think still have juice left in them. And it's Chris Godwin, it's Stefon Diggs, who are both coming off injuries. Stefon Diggs being a bit more serious. And then Keenan Allen, who is definitely, I mean, he's getting really up there in age, but he still put together some nice games with the Bears. So 3 guys that are still compelling when it comes to fantasy football and can help out a team. We'll get to that right after a quick break. Let's continue with our conversation about these free agent wide receivers. So we know Tee Higgins no longer a free agent. He can be traded for. We'll see if that happens. Davante Adams is now a free agent. And then the rest of the list is looking pretty bleak, but I am still interested in Chris Godwin, Stefon Diggs, and Keenan Allen, especially Chris Godwin. He just turned 29 years old. I know he's coming off that fractured ankle, but at least it's not a knee ligament or a ligament, right? I feel like it's a little bit easier when it's a fracture to come back. No, he's really only had 1 elite season in his career, right? But last year he was on pace to do some crazy things. I was shocked when I looked at this. He actually was this wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game. Now it was only 7 games, so that's cheating. I doubt he would have ended there, but he averaged 16.1 fantasy points per game in half PPR, behind only Jamar Chase. So he was on pace to do great things with averaging, over 82 receiving yards per game. He already had 5 touchdowns in those 7 games. Do you think he ends up back with the Buccaneers? I think that's a fine landing spot, but I do think a team will be willing to pay him as their wide receiver 1, or at least he could get that opportunity with a team like the Patriots or the Raiders or the Panthers. Like, there's a lot of teams out there looking for a wide receiver 1.
Yeah, when you look at this situation with the Bucs, they're not using the franchise tag on him, and they have to weigh: are they okay with Mike Evans and Jalen McMillan moving on, and maybe finding a rookie that can fill the slot role, or another player that's in free agency? There's not a lot of those options. Now, I think it's going to be really hard to retain him if they can't get a deal done before the tampering period starts, because the Patriots, we know they got Josh McDaniels back. They like to have a slot guy that's reliable. Tom Brady's influence is going to be the back door for the Raiders, right, in the similar situation to try to get a player like that there. We know the Jaguars, we'll see what Christian Kirk's injury is all about, but they've got Liam Cohen. And then you got Dave Canales looming there with the Panthers. Do they want Adam Thielen, or do they look for an upgrade with Godwin? So there's so many options. And then you can't forget about your Steelers. I think they'll be in the mix for sure, because he's a good complementary receiver as a guy that gets open to the big play threat, much like with Mike Evans, to what George Pickens can do in his skill set. So I think the Steelers and Patriots, I would say, are the top 2 teams that I would think want to be aggressive, because he's so valuable to a young quarterback. We assume the Steelers might have a young quarterback, even if Justin Fields and someone else. We know the Patriots have a young quarterback. So I think he's that type of receiver that's why I mentioned the Raiders as well. If they have a Shedeur Sanders, you get him in there with Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers, you've got some pretty good weapons there. So I think he's one of those sneaky, valuable players. Like, I think his fantasy hit is going to happen a little bit because he's such a good spot here with Baker Mayfield. It's been that way with Winston playing off Evans, but it could rebound depending on who that other target is on that team, who the quarterback is.
Yeah, there, like you said, the Patriots would be, I do think, a good landing spot for him. He could easily get 150 targets right away, right, with Drake May. If Drake May can make that next step forward, that could be a good landing spot. The Panthers back with Dave Canales. I do think that'd be a great spot for him too. If they move on from Adam Thielen, he can take over that Adam Thielen role, and I think he has a lot more juice in him than Adam Thielen does at this point. Also, the Broncos are a sneaky, interesting spot too with Bo Nix. They could really use a possession wide receiver to go with Cortland Sutton. So lots of landing spots for him. After Chris Godwin, it's a close tie between Stefon Diggs or Keenan Allen, who I think the next best free agent would be. Stefon Diggs, like, if he didn't tear his ACL, I think I'd still be relatively, high on him as a low-end wide receiver too. But he's 31 years old, coming off this torn ACL. It does normally take a full year to come back and be productive, so that's scary for next year. He was more productive with the Texans with a crowded wide receiver group than I thought. I'm going to have him as like a high-end wide receiver 3 type, maybe in the 30s. But there's a lot of landing spots for him too. Like, just a lot of teams need wide receivers. So if he could land with the Patriots or the Rams when they move on from Cooper Kupp, or the Giants be with Malik Neighbors back with Brian Daboll, like, there are still a lot of good landing spots for Stefon Diggs.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good spots. I think he's now number 2. He's not going to be that target monster he once was with Buffalo with Josh Allen. You mentioned Brian Daboll. He was the coordinator there. So was Ken Dorsey for a brief period of time before we had Joe Brady take over. He's now the passing game coordinator for the Cowboys. And we know the Cowboys also employ his brother at cornerback. So that could be a landing spot, playing off CeeDee Lamb and helping Dak Prescott. So you have to look at him as wide receiver 3. That's exactly where you look at him. Complimentary guy that you look at, where I think Godwin could have wide receiver 2 status on the right team.
And now Keenan Allen, I mean, there were a few games there where he was looking like Keenan Allen, right? He was getting a bunch of targets, putting up big yards, scoring a ton of touchdowns, which was wild. I mean, in that period from week 12 through 16, he scored 5 touchdowns there. So, like, I think he still does have some juice. I don't want him to be back with the Bears. I don't think that's the best for fantasy football in terms of him or the other guys, DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, right? Like, I want him to go somewhere else. He will be turning 33 years old in April, in like a month, right? So probably only has one more year in him, probably wants to go to a team he has a chance to win a Super Bowl. Is that back to the Chargers? Would they be open to that reunion? Again, another guy that could be a Cooper Kupp replacement, although Is it kind of just equaling out? I don't know. I brought up the 49ers for Davante Adams. I also think Keenan Allen would be a really good fit for the 49ers. I think they need to add someone. Keenan Allen would be cheap, veteran that could teach the young guys and fill in that role until Brandon Ayuk can come back healthy, but then still be a valuable asset after that. So I do think Keenan Allen to the 49ers would be interesting, or to the Rams or the Chargers. Those would be my top 3 spots.
Yeah, it's debating, DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen. These are all kind of the same type of guys.
I think Keenan Allen is well above that group, though.
Yeah, because he's always reliable as a big slot, right? I mean, Amari Cooper's got to find the right role. Is he a big play threat? Is he a number one? I don't know exactly what he is. DeAndre Hopkins, I don't know what he is. Is he just a role player at this point? Where Allen, we know he's got some jump to him, with what he did with Caleb Williams. I wonder if the Bears might think about bringing him back. I don't know if he wants to be back there, right? He's hinted at going to the Chargers, the Rams. They also represent Los Angeles, where he spent all of his career, Southern California, except for last season. So they're in the mix, but I could see like Denver coming in. I could see him in a bunch of teams because he's just one of those guys that's you can scheme open, he'll get open, help a young quarterback. So I would lean toward, if there's a young quarterback involved, that's where I think you might see Keenan Allen. I don't know if I want to see him necessarily with the Rams. I would want to see him back with the Chargers, actually, to help Justin Herbert. But I'm excited to see where all these guys land because they'll still have impact and help for the quarterbacks, other receivers, all that good stuff. So they can have fantasy value through other people, even if they're not the guys we're targeting.
Yeah, absolutely. That will be it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We will be back tomorrow. I'm sure there'll be more news dropping, but we'll be talking more fantasy football goodness. So don't miss that show. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye, y'all.